So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. I'd like to welcome you all to the 2024 Expanded Access 101 webinar. This year jointly hosted by the NYU Grossman School of Medicine, Division of Medical Ethics, Working Group on Compassionate Use and Pre-Approval Access, otherwise known heretofore to be called CUPA, because that is a mouthful, and the International Society for Cell and Gene Therapy's Expanded Access Working Group. On behalf of everyone, welcome to you all today. My name is MacCracken, and I thank you for joining us today for this 101 session around expanded access. For your awareness, I lead a group at Johnson & Johnson called Patient Strategies and Solutions, and we're responsible for expanded access, also known as pre-approval access. A key part of CUPA's mission is to educate all stakeholders in the space and to provide basics on an annual basis to a variety of audiences, particularly those who may have a touch point on the area. This year, the focus is on you as clinicians because you play a key role in not only identifying potential patients that may benefit from this therapy, but also, of course, you're a big part in making requests for this process. Just a couple logistics. We only have an hour, so I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and shorten this a little bit. We do have a Q&A function. We ask that you submit that through the Q&A. We're going to try to get to those at the last 15 minutes of this webinar. In case you miss anything, a link to the webinar, other resources about CUPA, glossary, etc., will be sent to you and also dropped in the chat. So without further ado, I'm going to start before handing it off to my colleague, Dr. Jinsy Andrews. And I'm going to briefly go over a very quick 101 on expanded access, kind of what I will call the what, the who, and the how. And we'll go through. Bear with me 1 second while I share my screen. John, can you give me control? I'm not able to share.
Yes.
Thanks so much.
Should be good to go.
Okie doke. There we go. Thank you. Okay. All right, just trying to get it in view. Technology is fantastic when it works. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go. John, can you just verify that this can be seen?
Yes, but it is not in presenter mode. We can see your slides on the left in the PowerPoint.
Yes, I know, and that's part of the sharing aspect. It's not allowing me to do it.
Oh, okay. I think it's fine. I say go ahead.
Brief, so I'm gonna forge ahead. Okay. So in brief, as I said, we're gonna do the what, who, and the how. Before you hear from other colleagues, I have to give you the traditional disclaimer and letting you know, and this probably applies to everyone here, but I won't speak for everyone, I'll speak for myself, that this is certainly an educational training. It is a nuanced topic, and by no means are we able to share all facets of expanded access with you today. And the opinions expressed here are those of mine. However, they are very fundamental basics around EA, not necessarily those of my company. So let's jump in. Let's answer the what first. That's what we're all here to talk about, which is what is expanded access? Expanded access is a legal pathway which allows the potential to access investigational medicines outside of clinical trials in cases where no comparable or satisfactory alternatives are available. So effectively, as many of us are aware, and you are all likely aware, clinical trials are the gold standard for accessing investigational medicines for a variety of reasons, primarily of which is the mechanism that allows us to make medicines available to the broader population. So this should be a finite population who is seriously or terminally ill, whose disease has exhausted all available therapies, and whom are not eligible for clinical trials. And not eligible for clinical trials may also include situations where perhaps a patient is 1,000 miles from a clinical trial site, does not have a mechanism to getting to that site. Logistics can effectively make someone ineligible. There also should be sufficient evidence to support the fact that potential benefit may outweigh the potential risks. And the word potential throughout this whole pathway is incredibly important because we are dealing with investigational treatments that have not been proven to be efficacious or safe yet. So we are always in the realm of potentiality in this aspect. And because of the population of patients that are potentially being treated, examining what the potential benefit risk ratio is, of course, very important. How does it work? A treating physician must agree to submit a request to both the company who is manufacturing the medicine or treatment under development and to the local health authority. I'm going to use US as an example. So in that case, it would be the FDA. Both requests must be submitted and both parties must approve. And a key aspect I think that gets lost sometimes in the media around other things is it is not the FDA's final decision on whether someone gets access. A manufacturer is not compelled and is not required to provide investigational medicines outside of clinical trials. That said, if a company is making it available, that company must approve to providing that medicine. How does that process work? That can vary by manufacturer or from whomever, a biotech, pharma company, what have you. That process will vary by the manufacturer as well as the health authority that's associated. And it's based on multiple factors. Does the company have a policy in place? Are they making the medicine available? What does the application process look like? Patient characteristics, eligibility, and eligibility of the program itself from an availability perspective. So a key caveat to providing expanded access is that you cannot jeopardize your clinical trial program. Again, the goal is always to bring medicine to a larger population. This is a bridge, not the only finite population to get access. So with that said, a couple additional considerations along this vein is important to understand. Expanded access is not research. It is a treatment pathway for patients with unmet medical need. Collection of information is limited to eligibility information. There are caveats to this, which we won't have time to get into today, but at its fundamental basic, expanded access is a treatment pathway. It is also not a substitute for clinical trial participation, and as I said, should not and must not jeopardize the ability to bring that medicine to bear for other patients. Along the same route, EA is a bridge to approved treatment for patients who are unable to wait for trials to be completed. So always, if a patient is eligible for a clinical trial, they must go to the clinical trial. And also from a legislative point of view or policy, at least in the United States, access to investigational medicines is not a fundamental right. And if any of you recall discussions around right to try, which was a legislative effort that came up years ago, this is part of that argument. People are not entitled to investigational medicines, nor is it required to be provided by companies. So that is a very quick, super fast round robin around the what, when, and who, and how. The only other item I'd add here is that this access may be provided in a singular or a group basis. So you may hear single patient access or cohort access. And that depends again on the various attributes that I mentioned earlier. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn it over to our colleague, Dr. Jinsy Andrews, who's going to provide you with a clinician perspective of expanded access. Thank you, Jinsy.
Thank you so much. And if there's any issues with my audio, please let me know. But I'm Dr. Jinsy Andrews. I'm the Director of Neuromuscular Clinical Trials at Columbia University. I'm also a CUPA member and work extensively in the expanded access realm, specifically for amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which is a serious life-threatening condition in the neurodegenerative space with no cure. Now, as a clinician, often the available therapies for ALS are meant to slow down disease, and often people who are living with ALS will then turn to investigational therapies. Most oftenly, that pathway to access investigational therapy is through clinical trials, as you heard. However, there are may not fit the clinical trial eligibility criteria. So as you heard Christine say, expanded access is intended as a treatment and traditionally for those that are not clinical trial eligible. Now, as a clinician, we'll walk through the risks and benefits of investigational therapies. And I think one of the things I want to address right off the bat is often there are scientific publications that will highlight a potential breakthrough for ALS. And this happened just last week. A new gene was identified and a mouse model showed some benefit. And so people asked me, can I get that drug? Well, often those scientific publications in preclinical space have not yet reached human clinical trials and have not even reached approval for treatment in humans. So when we talk about expanded access, we talk about investigational drugs that are available for a serious life-threatening condition that have some FDA oversight and approval for a trial in humans. Second, often if a patient has exhausted the FDA-approved therapies and have no options for entry into a clinical trial, that's when the conversation begins about expanded access. So often, as a clinician, I will talk to a patient and we'll discuss what is out there and what we know. The risks are sometimes uncertain because they may be in phase 1 or phase 2 level development. Sometimes we may know more about the risks because they might be in phase 3 and almost about to complete. And so often, most often, expanded access drugs are often offered when it's a late phase clinical trial and they're seeking approval from FDA and they're trying to broaden those that are not in the actual clinical trial. So my earliest experience actually was not in ALS, it was in Lambert-Eaton myasthenic syndrome, where a drug completed late phase clinical trial, showed a large impact or benefit, and the company or the manufacturer offered the drug through expanded access for the broader US-based population. And that was done as a treatment protocol. So as you heard earlier, there's different ways to access expanded access. So if I am trying to approach a manufacturer who is manufacturing an experimental or investigational therapy, I can ask as a single patient request. There could be an intermediate cohort request, and that can be through the manufacturer, or I can ask as a physician and sponsor that request. Or it could be a treatment protocol like the Lambert-Eaton myasthenic syndrome protocol, where the company intended for a large treatment protocol to be established through expanded access and FDA oversight. And that usually is sponsored by the manufacturer. Now, as you heard earlier, if someone is interested in investigational therapy and I want to help them get it, we have to approach the manufacturer. They have to agree. Once they agree, we then have to start the process. So sometimes manufacturers can help provide an informed consent template, a protocol, an investigator brochure, which then I can use to submit to my local ethics committee here at Columbia or the organization where a physician resides. Those documents will also help me complete an application to the FDA. And whether that is true, whether the physician is sponsoring that expanded access request or the manufacturer is requesting that manufacturer expanded access request. So once that application is complete and there is no dedicated staff and no extra time allotted for me as a physician to put those applications in. And that can be varied from specialty to specialty. And so once those are in, it seems easy, I should get the drug and be able to give it. But unfortunately, what happens is the investigational drug has to get approval by the FDA for an expanded access request. The drug company has to ship it to me, and then it has to come to my research pharmacy. It cannot be given directly to a person with a particular serious life-threatening condition. So there are costs and resources involved in expanded access from the clinician point of view. So I do have to make sure there are funds available to store a drug in a research pharmacy. I do have to have resources available to account for that drug and provide it and dispense it. I also have to make sure, just like in a clinical trial, even though I'm trying to treat a condition, I have to still report safety issues. So whether they're mild, moderate, or severe, resulting in a hospitalization, that has to be reported. And every year, an annual report has to be provided for safety issues that occur when you're providing investigational therapy through expanded access. So with all of that said, the the drug itself may be offered through the manufacturer. So I'm not addressing situations where a hospital or an academic institution manufactures the drug. I'm just only using the example of a manufacturer providing the drug. They may offer it for free, or there may be a cost associated with that. When we're monitoring safety, so sometimes I have to check kidney function and liver function. Sometimes that can be an out-of-pocket expense and a cost that's passed through to a person obtaining the investigational therapy. The cost and resources at the site to monitor somebody over that's accessing investigational therapy through expanded access. So the physician time, a research staff time, and then research pharmacy costs. And of course, if the drug is given by mouth, it's easy. But if it is something that requires a spinal tap or requires IV infusion in a hospital, there are additional costs that are not covered by and not necessarily bound by payers to cover. And sometimes can be an additional cost that has to be covered to administer an investigational therapy. So those are some of the challenges and some of the logistics from a clinician standpoint on expanded access and to obtain investigational therapy through that mechanism. Now, I met an ALS clinician, and so there are broader activities to increase how the blurring of the line about using investigational therapy for treatment and using it for obtaining additional research or scientific, that is going to be different from each disease to disease, just like the easy, just as the ease of accessing investigational therapy could be different from condition to condition. So it's very important for the clinician to be aware of what's FDA approved for the disease. And if they're dealing with a serious life-threatening condition, it is important to make sure that you are aware of investigational products that might be in development for that particular condition, and the process by which you would make an application. Often there are, in academic institutions, there can often be a regulatory or a liaison that can help the physician apply. I wasn't fully aware when I first got to Columbia, but then I was able to establish a relationship. It does require IRB approval and informed consent process where you talk about the risks and benefits. And so those are some of the key opportunities and challenges in trying to provide access from a clinician's perspective. And I know there's others on this webinar that will talk about the regulatory process and framework. So with that, I'll just conclude and hand it over to the next person that will provide additional information. So I'll hand it over to Dave.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just bring up my slides. So I'm David Wallach, Director of Regulatory Affairs and Business Operations at NYU, and previously served as the Director of the IRB at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. And I'm excited to be here to speak to you about the role of the IRB in expanded access. So before we talk about the actual role, let's talk about what an IRB itself is. Specifically, it's defined as a group designated by an institution to review and approve research involving human subjects. The primary purpose of that review is to ensure the protection of the subjects in that research, and the review typically focuses on the protocol and consent. Now, you may be wondering why we're talking about IRBs if we're here to talk about expanded access, because IRBs seem to be focused on research. And while that's true, the FDA went on to assign the responsibility for reviewing expanded access requests to IRBs. And presumably they did that because they're an entity that's used to looking at unapproved products, considering risks and benefits, and making sure that there is consent and that consent is written in a way that's comprehensible, a lot of things that overlap, even though they're two distinct pathways. For single patient expanded access, even though the IRB is a group of people, the clinician can request that the FDA allow review by a single member of that IRB, and that often facilitates a quicker turnaround by the IRB. Just to give you a sense of how IRBs typically operate, I have heard over the years people use the term IRB to refer to all different kinds of things, whether it's the protocol or the study that they're submitting. I'm submitting my IRB, or their approval. I got my IRB today. They're often referring to things other than the actual IRB, which is a board. It's a group of people, and that group of people is supported by an administrative staff who are often also called the IRB. So there's a lot of confusion about the term IRB. I'll try to be specific in certain cases where I think it is relevant. The first two bullets talk about resources that the IRBs will have, policies and procedures, as well as forms to submit your request for review by the IRB. And so as I indicated in terms of the IRB staff versus the IRB board, the researchers or clinicians will typically be interacting with the IRB admin staff much more than the actual board. The admin staff are kind of like a liaison between the two. And those staff will answer questions and assess the submissions for completeness, and also evaluate them for consistency with institutional policies. And where appropriate, may refer them for additional review. For example, if whether it's a study or expanded access involves a product that is the invention of the clinician or the researcher who's involved, they may send that for review by the Conflict of Interest Committee. In addition, the IRB is responsible for making sure that the studies that they review or the expanded access meet all of the requirements. And when they do, after having been forwarded to them for review, they relay that back to the IRB staff, who then communicate with the researcher or clinician that the study is approved or that changes are required. So as you can see from these first couple slides, the IRB admin office and the IRB in general is your ally, okay? In addition to the materials I referenced earlier and providing advice, the IRB in general, most IRBs will have templates for protocols and consents, both for research and often for expanded access as well. And they can also serve as kind of a matchmaker to identify resources in the institution that the researcher or clinician may need. I have a colleague who was telling me recently that they were at a particular institution for a number of years before they realized that there was an office like the one that I lead, the Regulatory Affairs Office, to support the researcher in submitting to the FDA. And all along had been doing the submissions on their own, and later found that this resource was available. So I just wanted to give you a list of some of the resources that may be available and that you may be interested in seeking out if you are pursuing this. So the first is Regulatory Affairs, which is my office, and that is to support the submission of materials to the FDA, whether it's for research or for expanded access. General counsel or contracting, who may be involved in interacting with the external party, the manufacturer of the drug, if it's coming from a different company. The pharmacy, as Jinsy mentioned earlier, the drug is going to have to be received and handled by the pharmacy in most cases. Finance or budgeting, different entities that deal with the money, as Jinsy indicated also, there's a certain cost to doing this, and many institutions want to ensure that their costs are covered or that they budget accordingly. And as I mentioned earlier, the Conflict of Interest Committee could be very important as well. Now, in evaluating anything, whether it's a new study or expanded access, the IRB is going to consider these 7 things that you see here. The first is that risks to subjects are minimized. This is first on the list, but should be obvious because in everything we do, we should always be minimizing risk, but especially in research or expanded access. Second is a slight variation where there are risks, and there are bound to be risks when you're dealing with an unapproved product. We want to make sure that those risks are reasonable in relation to the anticipated benefits. And so, the population that we're dealing with in expanded access is going to have a serious or life-threatening condition. So the capacity to accept a certain amount of risk is going to be pretty high, but you still have to weigh that with the anticipated benefits, because the benefits might not be that high. We don't know how well this drug or other investigational product may work. So it's really a careful evaluation that needs to be considered. The third here on this list is selection of subjects is equitable. And what this means is that there are no populations that are being unduly burdened in research, or that certain populations have better access to what in this case might be potential treatment versus others. And in single patient, it's harder to consider this element because it's not like you're seeking out patients, or even that this one patient who sought you out is going to be considered in this equitable manner. But especially in the larger treatment IND type studies, expanded access for groups of people or cohorts, as was referred to earlier, you want to make sure that, and the IRB is going to make sure that the participation is equitable. 4 and 5 are the consent is obtained and that it's documented. And then the last two are more for research, but also could have some applicability to expanded access, that there's monitoring of the data, and that the privacy of the participants are protected. Now, when it comes to expanded access, there are a couple of additional considerations that were, I think, referenced a little earlier, but I'll just reiterate them. The first is that the patient has to have a serious or immediately life-threatening condition or disease or condition. There is no comparable or satisfactory alternative therapy, and that providing the investigational product will not interfere with investigational trials. So the first of these, I think, is pretty clear. The second, basically the idea is if there are approved methods of treatment, try those first, because what we're dealing with in expanded access may sound promising, but it's not proven, and we don't know how well it works, and we may not really understand the full risk profile either. Finally, I think someone in the chat had asked earlier about whether it's appropriate or fair to require that people participate in a clinical trial before they could have access to expanded access. And the idea here is that expanded access is kind of like treatment, but it's not treatment. It's still, kind of a shot in the dark. And without clinical trials, we will be unable to figure out whether any of the new products are, safe and effective. Those are the two criteria that we're looking for in pretty much any product that wants to get approved. And so if we are unable to conduct clinical trials because everyone wants to access the products through expanded access, we'll be stuck in this situation where we don't know if any of them actually work. So for the good of society, clinical trials are the priority. And if there's a patient for whom a clinical trial is not practical because they don't qualify or they don't live nearby or other factors like that, then and only then would they be considered for access to that product through expanded access. So to kind of sum things up and to explain IRB's role in this, I just wanted to sort of go through a quick thought exercise. So you have a patient who says that they've tried everything and they're ineligible for clinical trials, or maybe they tried the clinical trials and they have still not been treated, cured, etc. So the patient says, are there any other options? I'll try anything. And the clinician says, well, let me speak to the manufacturer about using their unapproved product through expanded access, right? So the patient is desperate. The doctor is optimistic. The manufacturer says, okay, which doesn't have to be the case, as was mentioned earlier. It's up to the manufacturer to decide. But in this case, the manufacturer says, okay. So it's up to the IRB to say, well, hold on, slow down. What if things don't go as planned? And some of you might be thinking that this is similar to the FDA's role and that they are related. And it's not that the IRB is specifically here to stop things, but they're here to take off the rose-tinted glasses and say, let's take a moment to consider this and make sure that our I's are dotted and our T's are crossed, and that this patient who's desperate for this really has all of the information to make as informed a decision as is possible. Here are just a few resources I wanted to share with you. If you're a clinician and you're dealing with preparing to submit to the FDA, if you're at an academic medical institution or other institution that has an IRB, you can talk to them about the resources that they have available. If you don't, you have a sort of a tough situation ahead of you, because you'd have to find an IRB that would be willing to review for you, and there's certain complexity to that. But there are these resources that are available. The first is the Expanded Access Navigator, which provides some information about single patient expanded access and was created by a unique partnership between the entities that you see listed. The Projects Facilitate is from the FDA. It's their own system and process for helping oncologists get treatment for their cancer patients. And then the last link is the FDA's own website on general expanded access resources. Thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to hand things off to Bambi.
Hello, everyone. Let me see. Okay. Hoping that's working. Is that working? Okay.
Can't see your slides, Bambi.
You cannot.
No. Could you try again?
Or let me see if I can try again. Hold on. I have to try again. Let me get your screen. Oh, one. Yeah. Someone else is sharing or something.
We can see your computer screen. We can't see your slides.
Now?
There we go. Perfect.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So I'm Bambi Grilley. I work at Baylor College of Medicine. So I work in an academic institution. And just to give you some concept, I've submitted 78 patient-specific protocols under 46 patient-specific INDs. I've done one intermediate use expanded access program, and I'm involved in 6 EAPs for products that other companies are releasing as treatment protocols. And I think for most people who work in oncology or in academia, these are not unusual things to see. But I think that it's a very complicated area, and I'm really glad that there's sessions like this. When I was asked to talk about institutional issues, I wasn't sure I had anything to share. And then once I started going through this in my mind, I realized that there's quite a bit to talk about with this. So, this was sort of spoken about by Jinsy, but I want to kind of clarify that there's different places that expanded access products can come from. The first is that there are institutions that manufacture their own products, and they might have their own INDs, and from there they might want to provide some products to patients off of protocol. The second is, and this is much more common, is that it's externally manufactured by a sponsor, and that they will allow an investigator or an institution to use the product on their own IND. And the third, which is the nicest of all possibilities, is that some sponsors actually will provide external products, but they have a protocol that they let you put the patient on. That's sort of what I was talking about with an expanded access protocol. Or they'll have their own, they'll allow you to have your patient placed on their own IND. So what I'm going to talk about when I talk about institutional responsibilities is really the latter to the externally manufactured products, because that's where things get more complicated, I think, from an institutional perspective. And when I talk about the institution, I'm talking about a medical school, I'm talking about a hospital, sometimes I'm even talking about clinics, especially if they're organized series or set of clinics. But in any event, it would be the overarching entity in which the patient is going to be treated. And so when you talk about complications, the most complicated type of one is the one where it's internally manufactured. That's primarily from a regulatory perspective. But externally can get very complicated with regards to both regulatory issues, as David discussed, but also those institutional issues of protecting the patient, protecting the institution, making sure that everything is set up so that the patient is treated properly. So as we start this process, and Jinsy spoke about this a little bit, it starts usually with an investigator, and the FDA defines even a treating physician once they get in this role of being involved in expanded access, they are also referred to as an investigator. So the investigator / treating physician contacts the sponsor, asks whether they have this product. The sponsor, if they have an organized program, usually has some sort of form that they want the investigator to fill out that gives some justification for the patient, you know, why the patient is correct for this treatment, why this treatment is correct for this patient. It usually includes some information about who the physician is as well. And then finally, it includes information about who's going to be dispensing the product, which, again, Jinsy talked about this, but especially if it's going to be given IV, there's going to need to be either somebody from a pharmacy or if it's a cell therapy from a GMP laboratory. But in any event, there will be somebody who needs to dispense and administer the product. And so the company's going to want to make sure that all of that is in order before they agree to provide the product. The submission of this form can sometimes require that you enter into what the company has a specific portal for these types of things. So that can take some time and definitely requires some work from the investigator or whoever's helping the investigator. The investigator will need to get the regulatory documents. So that's the protocol, it's the investigator's brochure, and sometimes yes and sometimes no, the sponsor will provide a model consent form that can be used specifically for these type of patient-specific or expanded access submissions. And those are all used both for support of the FDA submission, but also, to David's point, for support of the IRB submission. But the other thing that's going to be required, especially with external manufacturers, is obtaining other what we call agreement documents. Specifically, and this is more uncommon, there might be non-disclosure agreements because the company is releasing private information or confidential information about the status of the product, what they've seen in patients, and many things that they really don't want to be front page news in the newspaper at any particular point in the drug development process. So they may require non-disclosure agreements. But more importantly, they're probably going to require a clinical trial agreement, or what we would usually call a contract, because they will want to specify kind of the parameters under which the product should be given to the patient and the liability that might be associated with that. And so I have this sample routing of a CTA. And the reason I'm showing you, and I'm not going to go through all the details of it, but the reason I'm showing this is to show you that it looks very much like the standard routing of a clinical trial agreement. So within an institution or a hospital, there might be a number of ways that the contract needs to go and a number of people who need to review it and things like that. I think the important thing when you talk about expanded access is that even if this process has to happen, it usually can be done in quite an expedited way. And so, for instance, here at Baylor, if you're doing expanded access as compared to a standard clinical trial, usually make a call and say, this is for a patient who needs this treatment. And then these people will review things much more rapidly than the standard review process, but it doesn't go through an abbreviated review. It goes through the regular review. There's usually, I wanted to talk about this because I think one of the institutional things that will be discussed or will be considered as you talk about expanded access is cost. So backing up a little bit, a qualifying clinical trial assessment is an assessment that's done for compliance with Medicare rules that define what a qualifying clinical trial is. Many institutions use the qualifying clinical trial assessments to expand beyond Medicare patients and say, okay, we're going to use this same assessment for all patients to make the differentiation between what would be standard of care costs and what would be those costs that are associated specifically with the protocol or the investigational drug. The standard costs are designated as routine costs, and those costs will be billed to the patient's insurance. Because expanded access is usually a timely process, there's usually not time for a QCT review. And so that's usually waived by most institutions who are looking at an expanded access protocol and making determinations about what will or won't be paid. But regardless of whether it goes through a QCT review or not, it's important to know that the investigational product itself shouldn't be charged to the patient or their insurer unless the company or the IND holder has obtained specific approval from the FDA called a cost recovery approval. So what this does is say, you know, unless you have this cost recovery, you can charge for the standard labs that this patient would get because of their disease, or the standard x-ray that this patient would receive because of their disease, but the drug itself cannot be charged to the patient. And I want to reiterate that because it's extremely important, because it's considered fraud if you charge for an investigational drug. So unless you have cost recovery. I'm going to switch gears and talk about logistics. One of the logistics that I think Jinsy talked about was about the pharmacy. So one of the logistics will be determining whether you have access to a pharmacy or a laboratory that can properly receive the product, store the product, and importantly, maintain records of the product. Investigational drugs, unlike standard medications, are handled more like narcotics in that you have to actually track how many vials or how many tablets you received, how many went to the patient, what happened to the remainder of them. So somebody has to actually keep those records, and it's usually the pharmacists. You have to ensure that the institutional requirements for ordering the product are met. A lot of institutions have electronic medical records, which require certain electronic orders. All of that stuff needs to be set up as if it's, as if this is standard treatment, because you have to have a way to properly order the medication and any supportive care that the patient needs to receive that. And finally, ensuring that billing is done properly, which is separate from making a decision about what should be billed, is actually working with the billing office to make sure that the patient is not billed for things that they shouldn't be billed for. If the patient will require inpatient hospitalization, that requires some planning as well. But most importantly is planning for the training that needs to happen, because it's one thing for you as the investigator physician to know what the patient is receiving and what the toxicities are, and kind of like what the treatment should look like. But if the patient's going to be inpatient, there's other people that will need to know, which include the floor nurses. Obviously, we talked about the pharmacists. And if the patient's going to be staying overnight and you're not going to be on, on call 24 hours a day, anybody who's covering also needs to know the specifics around that. So it requires a little bit of thought about what training is required and how you're going to make that happen. If there's specific treatments for toxicities, that has to be available. A good example of that is CAR T cells can cause something called cytokine release syndrome that uses a product that's not commonly on formulary, which is called tocilizumab. And so when a patient is receiving CAR T cells, one of the things on the checklist is making sure that the hospital has tocilizumab in-house. So for any product, there needs to be at least a moment spent thinking, are there things that I need to have in-house that might not be standard of the formulary of the pharmacy? And then last but not least, Jinsy talked about this, is submitting data to the sponsor. Primarily, it's going to be focused on safety data, but the sponsor may require that it be submitted electronically, and there may be other requirements around that. All of those details should be specified in the clinical trial agreement. But the important thing is to think about who's going to actually do that work, because it's not always an inconsiderable amount of effort to submit data to the sponsor. So with that, I'm going to hand off to the next person, which is Laertis.
Okay, thank you, Bambi. Let me share my screen. Presenter mode. Okay, hope anyone can see my screen. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Laertis Ikonomou. I'm the immediate past chair of the ISCT Committee on the Ethics of Cell and Gene Therapy, and also a member of the ISCT Expanded Access Working Group. In the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to give you the perspective of our working group on expanded access, and I would like to start with some introductory slides, introduce the ISCT, our society, to people that are not familiar with our work and why would be interested in this pathway. So the ISCT is a global society, and as the name indicates, we are our mission is to drive clinical translation of cell and gene therapies worldwide. And we are a truly global society. We have members in almost every continent, more than 3,500 members. We work a lot with regulatory societies, with regulatory authorities, with other institutions. And we are patient-centric, so everything we do addresses barriers at every step of the translational pathway from bench to bedside and every stage of the developmental process. So it means that we work in preclinical development, clinical development, launch, and patent patient access, and also technological research. So to achieve that, as I mentioned, we have several standing committees, more than 40 standing committees that have scientific, regulatory, and industry expertise. And a big part of our mission is expert-guided education and training. So we have professionals from all levels and disciplines, and we are very active in publishing peer-reviewed papers, building consensus on various issues that concern the development of cell and gene therapies, and also developing best practices. So given all this, we, of course, took a particular interest in expanded access pathway, because it's a pathway that is clear by now by the previous speakers that present some unique challenges. So I'm not going to belabor this point. That was presented very well by the previous speakers. It is a mechanism to provide non-trial access to unapproved interventions. And as has been said before, the main goal is to treat patients rather than to generate safety and efficacy data for regulatory approval and marketing authorization. So it's clear then that that poses potential bioethical and regulatory issues. And to address these type of issues, the ISCT established a working group in February 2022, where an offshoot of the ISCT Committee on the Ethics of Cell and Gene Therapy. And we have a diverse representation with clinicians, scientists, bioethicists, and law and regulatory experts. And as you can see on this slide, our mandate was initially to identify and address this type of issues, ethical, practical, and regulatory issues that arise from the use and potential misuse of the expanded access pathway. And then part also of our objective, our mission was to generate educational resources. So in the past 2 years or so, we have our first output from our group. So we published a short report last year on the future of expanded access to unapproved cell and gene therapies. And in this report, I would like to highlight some main issues. We identified some main issues, potential bioethical issues, and as I will explain later on, we're working towards a set of guidelines. So these main issues we identified, one, and it's been also indicated by the previous speakers, is to strike the right balance between non-trial access to experimental treatments, such as the one provided by expanded access, but also unimpeded contact of clinical trials and evidence generations. And these are, in fact, as also been said before, can be in tension. So the main goal of expanded access is to provide access to an unapproved medicine, in our case, cell and gene therapy products, but at the same time that can interfere with the conduct of clinical trials. Patients may have access to the product, but then become ineligible for future clinical trials, especially for rare diseases that can really affect the conduct of trials. And as David mentioned, that's a very important point. We conduct clinical trials for the good of society and for future generations of patients. We want to generate the necessary data that will lead to marketing authorization and offering this product to the general population. Another issue we have identified, a potential issue with the use, or rather the misuse of the expanded access pathway, is the risk of premature commercialization. So what does this mean? A provider may decide to use or misuse the expanded access pathway as a means to commercialize a product, although that's definitely not, clearly not the purpose of this pathway. Then that will lead to exaggerated representations of the product. This is still an investigational product. an offering at large groups of patients, a way to generate income for a company, and that, of course, will lead to patient exploitation and really using the pathway in the sense that it was not meant to be. And a third issue we identified is also equity in access. We, of course, we all strive for equitable access, patient access to cell and gene therapy products, including investigational products. But there is always the risk that patients with higher socioeconomic statuses, they can access these investigational products more easily than other patients because they have better physicians, because their physicians are more familiar with the expanded access pathway. And also, we can also have access, and we have seen that we can have crowdfunding funding campaigns by patients to raise funds to access these types of investigational products. And unfortunately, sometimes these campaigns turn into a popularity contest. People that can present an attractive campaign can raise these funds more easily than other patients. So this was a third issue, a main issue we identified with potential misuse of the expanded access pathway. So where do we go from there? As a group, we are working on a code of ethics to develop a set of guidelines, a code of ethics that regarding provision of unapproved cell and gene therapy products through the expanded access pathway. And that's kind of a teaser, a preview of what we're working on. Hopefully, we'll have this code of ethics published later this year. And our aim is also to have this code of ethics widely adopted by healthcare institutions, clinicians, and product developers. So some of the issues we're trying to work on and develop detailed guidelines is communication with patients that kind of extends beyond consent forms. So make it clear to patients that this is an investigational product, that the risks and benefits are well represented, that is not necessarily a beneficial product, so that they have a very clear image of what they're going to receive. Also, to develop a set of guidelines for cost recovery versus premature commercialization. Of course, product developers can charge for expanded access products through cost recovery, but we want to make sure we don't cross a fine line when suddenly this becomes a way to prematurely commercialize a product rather than provide it to seriously ill patients with no other alternative. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, we're working towards a set of detailed guidelines on how this mechanism, even if it provides access to investigational products, can be done in a way that assures the equitable patient access. So these are some of the main issues, and stay tuned. We'll have this set of guidelines published later this year. And with that, I would like to acknowledge the ISCT Expanded Access Working Group, the Committee on the Ethics of Cell and Gene Therapy, and the head office, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Laertis. I wonder if you could take a question that has come through, actually for you.
Okay.
Let me just take this. Hang on one second, and then Jinsy, I know there's one pending for you. And this is for you, Laertis. Can you speak to the unique emotional aspects of appeals for expanded access in the cell and gene therapy for rare or ultra-rare diseases? How can ethics be maintained by companies in these situations? And I'm happy to throw my perspective in if helpful after you finish.
Sure. So the question, if I understand correctly, is expanded access to mostly focused on rare and ultra-rare diseases. Is that correct? Yes.
Yeah.
So that's a great question. I think that's a big challenge because, for example, some ultra-rare diseases we are not even able to do clinical trials because there are so few patients. And in fact, there was a paper, I think, from CUPA last year, including members from the CUPA group, that stated that gene therapy companies have an ethical obligation to provide access, to have expanded access programs that provide access to this type of therapies. I think it should be organized in a way that these products are available to patients if they cannot be part of a clinical trial, but also and make sure that at least, although that's not the main goal of expanded access, to generate as many data as possible. So it should kind of strike a balance between providing this access, but also try to collect as many data as possible through this pathway that can help for the product development, because it is just hard to conduct clinical trials in rare and ultra rare diseases, and we don't want patients now going through this path while a product system is still investigational, especially because a lot of these products have shown to be highly effective and they are already commercialized, especially for monogenic diseases. But at the same time, there are other issues of safety, long-term effects that can only be addressed by monitoring and clinical trials. So I hope I answered this question. I'm just saying it's a delicate question. It's a hard question.
Yeah, as I always like to say, nuance is the key word in this area.
Right.
From an industry perspective, I would just add that I think in rare or ultra rare, or really any disease where expanded access is being applied, that the equity and the consistency principles are applied from a company as best as possible. Meaning, if there is criteria, that criteria is for all patients, regardless of who you are, what you're connected to,
Right.
or what you have access to. That is, my request is the same as Laertis's request, etc. And so if even in limited resources, those are applied consistently and equitably, that is certainly, in my view, an obligation for anyone making expanded access available. Thank you, Laertis. Jinsy, were you going to answer the question about Neuron?
Yeah, I think Bambi had a comment first.
Okay, great. Sorry, Bambi, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to this conversation, because the timing is perfect, that ISCT is having our annual meeting next week, and we're starting the meeting with something called the Global Regulatory Summit, and the focus of it is rare diseases, and specifically cell and gene therapy area. And we're bringing together regulators from around the world to discuss this issue, because I think that aside from the expanded access, the whole issue of what clinical trials in the rare disease space look like, how to get these products to market, it's all very much, we're right on the cusp of it all. So just to let you know that we're all focused on it, even on the regulator side.
Great. Thanks, Bambi.
So I think I was going to field the next question, which was a question about stem cell therapy. There was a specific question about stem cell therapy in ALS, and I since I'm an ALS clinician on this call, I thought I'd go ahead and answer.
Naturally.
So the question was about mesenchymal stem cells that are being manufactured by a company called Brainstorm. They did complete a phase 3 study. They did go through an advisory committee, and they did not achieve approval. They did announce earlier this year that they went through a special protocol assessment and agreed upon a phase 3B clinical trial design to answer some of the questions in our community that I think do need to be answered about some of the stories of people who've experienced the clinical trial and felt that they had a benefit. So they're going to try to confirm that signal through this clinical trial. Currently, there is no announcements or no knowledge, as far as I'm aware, of any expanded access that will be currently offered. I think, much like many drugs that are being developed for ALS, they're small companies with limited resources. And so they're trying to really answer the question as quickly as possible through the clinical trial so that they can get the answer and try to get the drug approved should they see a benefit, and get it more broadly distributed should it meet its endpoints. With that said, the company is keenly aware of the need when you're doing a late phase clinical trial, trying to provide open label access, and should there be a signal that they should plan ahead. And I think clinicians and scientists also work with a lot of companies to talk about making sure they have drug supply and resources in late phase clinical trials if they are planning for open label extension and expanded access. Now, what Bambi said is, and Bambi's presentation is very critical to this point, because as ALS is moving into the field with cell therapies, T cells and stem cells, getting these through expanded access is very complex, and it just doesn't fit with the manufacturer and with a clinician or ALS specialist. Hospitals and organizations and other functional areas. Like for me, if I want to do stem cells, I have to have hematology and oncology on board as well. So that it is complicated operationally and logistically to get those off the ground at an institution.
Thanks, Jinsy. Bambi, there's a specific question for you in the Q&A that I'm gonna point to you if you don't mind taking. This is requested to cover, so I'll just read it as is. I'm not sure if you can see it yet. As FDA rules covers cost recovery only for investigational intervention, but not the care and other treatment, what information is known or available on whether large institutions are billing insurers or sponsors, and less transparent to the requester than is the case with rogue stem cell clinics than drugs overall?
So I'm not entirely sure that I understand the complete scope of the question, but what I would say in general is that most institutions that are involved in any kind of research are very aware of what is considered, the costs that you can bill for. So again, to get back to that, if a patient needs pre-medications to receive an investigational drug, you can bill the insurer for the pre-medications. You just can't bill for the investigational drug. So it's kind of a fine tune, and I'm not a person who does budgets at that level, so I don't want to get into the weeds about it, but I'll just say that most institutions who are involved in research at all are very well aware what you can or can't bill for. So literally the part that you can't bill for at all is the investigational drug unless it's got cost recovery approved by the FDA. The part where I'm less sure what this question is about is this less transparent is the case with rogue stem cell clinics than drugs overall. I think that the issue there, the question that they might be asking is, can patients pass those costs on to insurers? And I guess I would say in theory, yes, because rogue stem cell clinics are, I think Laertis and I would agree, on the edges of the law to begin with. So their concern about whether they're billing properly is probably not at the same level as whether a hospital is worried about whether they're billing properly.
Yeah.
But that being said, I think that most rogue stem cell clinics, in the way that we usually discuss those terms, require patients to pay themselves. So I think that's a different level. So I don't think that I can really speak to what every rogue stem cell clinic does, but I think that generally accepted is that patients usually pay for that out of pocket.
Thanks, Bambi.
Yeah, I can add to that, that's absolutely true. In fact, insurance, because there's so little evidence of efficacy in these treatments, stem cell clinics, there are no insurance that cover any of this. So it's more clearly that the cost comes from the payment comes from the patients, and there are no insurance that will cover this type of interventions.
Thank you, Laertis. We have a live question. It's been very patient. Samuel Kudo, could you go ahead and state your question, please?
I'm not sure that they'll be able to unmute, Christine, so you might have
Okay,
to.
Samuel, if you want to put your question in the chat, then go ahead and I'll try to catch that for us. So then I'm going to go to another question, and this is really for anyone on the panel. One of the questions for us is, what are the perspectives on real-world data collection within EAPs? And so I'll ask anyone if they'd like to start. Maybe David, from the IRB perspective, what are your thoughts? Sorry to put you on the spot.
No problem. So it's a very controversial area, or at least a little bit controversial. Certainly, on the one hand, nobody wants good data to go to waste, or so we have a patient who's undergoing experience with this investigational product. Let's at least find out a little bit about how this works so we can use that information in some way. So there's value to that. On the other hand, the more data and the more rigorous you are about collecting it, the closer you are to conducting a clinical trial. And if you're conducting a clinical trial, then it's not expanded access. So in CUPA, I think an offshoot of CUPA, there is a working group on using real-world evidence. I'm not on that subgroup, so I don't know if any of the other members on here can comment on that group's thoughts or feedback. But the bottom line is, the FDA is sort of working through its process of trying to figure out how to deal with real-world data and real-world evidence. Certainly, there is the opportunity to learn from the expanded access use, and it's a matter of finding the right balance between those two competing interests.
Yeah. Jinsy, could I ask you to comment on that, because this is certainly at play a lot in the world of ALS trials. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there was one comment already from Jesre Bourne about the acceptability for data generated through an expanded access program here in the US or compassionate use in Europe. Europe generally, regulatory authorities have some issue looking at it, and it depends on how, I'm going to say it depends on what you intend to do with that data. That's a very key question, and FDA has been a little bit more flexible. Classically, when we look at expanded access, and I've worked in different neurodegenerative diseases and neuromuscular diseases, EAP data has been used to provide safety and tolerability issue in a more broader population than what was studied in the clinical trial, because sometimes these clinical trials have restrictive eligibility criteria. So that's one way of using it. Second is that sometimes it will be used as supportive data or descriptive data in a regulatory sense when looking at FDA. So the primary efficacy data will come from a controlled clinical trial in that disease condition. But on occasion, there have been instances in neurology where supportive data or descriptive data comes from the expanded access or even an open label extension of a main controlled study. Now, with all that said, in ALS, we've had an unusual situation where there has been support and increased funding for expanded access. So there was another question that I hit that I would answer live, because there was a question about, is it expected that EAPs will not provide funding to the sites? And I will say that there are examples of where just the manufacturer provides the drug and then there's no additional funding for resources. And we've done it in ALS, and I will say there's a clear difference in the number of people that gain access of investigational products through expanded access when there's no funding versus the number of people that gain access when there is funding. So, and sometimes some of these programs don't get it even off the ground at some institutions because there is no funding to support personnel or research pharmacy costs. And that can create some differences in access and accessibility for a patient population. The Act for ALS is a legislation that was put into law at the end of 2021, and that has increased the number of slots that are available, but still not huge. And prior to that, a lot of expanded access programs in ALS were run through philanthropy. And so donations to the center will allow a pool of money to support the additional personnel and staffing to try to get expanded access off the ground. But those were really on the order of 20 patients, 30 patients, and intermediate studies. Now there are several programs that are looking to do 100, 200, 250 people per program. So funding does make a difference in terms of the expanded access, especially in certain conditions. And last, I'll say, the other problem is that often a lot of conditions like ALS, natural history data is generated from clinic-based databases, which can be different from clinic to clinic or clinical trials. So then there was this whole population of patients that we don't have any data. And therefore we could not, for example, create validated algorithms to predict outcomes in more advanced populations, right? So collecting data from an expanded access portion provides us to get more broader clinical data for us to do future research and even collect samples to do future research for. So I think in that way, there could be some potential uses beyond what we know traditionally.
Thanks, Jinsy. Any other comments on that before we go to the next question?
I have a minor comment, which is just that I think one of the things we're kind of talking about here is the difference between an expanded access program, which is a larger program, or even an intermediate size versus a patient specific. And I realize this is sort of a a generic statement to make, but I think it goes to the expanded access pathway, which is that frequently the patients who end up wanting or needing to be in an expanded access, specifically at a patient-specific level, are patients who are quite ill. And so the outcomes there are going to be significantly different than the patients who are on the clinical trial. And that's one reason that there is resistance, usually from the sponsor, to collect outcomes data on those patients, because it doesn't contribute to the ability to get the product to market if all the expanded access patients don't have a good outcome, right? So it is different. And I think that when we talk about this, we have to parse out that part that's like, which of these patients weren't well enough to receive the product and that went this pathway versus expanded access programs, which are set up to allow access to a broad number of patients.
Yeah, thanks, Pam. And I would, just to add to the controversy, if we want to say this is controversial, I would say that, if we're looking to your very good point around patient populations being designedly different, right? You have a controlled population in clinical trials in order to bring that drug to market. Now, there's also debate on how real world some clinical trial populations are. We can have a whole other webinar on that in and of itself. But I think if we look at, separating the two, we have a debate a lot in some circles around EA, certainly not real world either, because you have a very ill, generally, population. So my personal view in calling it real world collection is not real world, one, because it's not out in the world yet. We don't have safety and efficacy proven. And so just to add that kind of to the mix of the discussion, I think real world is a term that is applicable and not applicable at the same time, depending on the situation. So just to throw that in. Okay, there's one question here for all of us. Can a physician request expanded access if the clinical trial option exists, but is less preferable? How should we be counseling our patients about these options? Who would like to go first?
I guess I'll start since I face this often. So it is true that a clinical trial might be running, and more often than not, a person living with ALS, for example, may not be eligible. But there's, it's already in clinical trials and they're asked, and so it does require asking the company, and the company has to be willing to provide it. Now, again, I'm using the example of someone who is not clinical trial eligible, and I know there's a little bit of discussion in the Q&A in the background about eligibility criteria and whether whether that's blurring a line, and maybe are we truly protecting clinical trials, or are people kind of drifting into expanded access, and maybe we are affecting our clinical trial enrollment. And then the trickier part is, for example, maybe there are expanded access programs available, but there's no clinical trial running, but there will be one 6 months down the line. And then you put somebody on expanded access, and then they are no longer eligible for the future clinical trials. So that's something that I think we're contending with in ALS. But I think in that scenario where if there's a clinical trial running and somebody is truly not clinical trial eligible, then the request can be made to the manufacturer. I've certainly done that. And on occasion, I get someone to provide it, or they might think about providing an expanded access program depending on what phase. And usually they're more keen on doing it if they're phase 2 or phase 3. I think when Bambi was referring to risk, depends on what kind of product it is, what kind of resources it takes. So the route of administration, is it intravenous, is it intrathecal or through a spinal tap, is it oral? What phase of development it's in, and what the risks are. And of course, any discussion starts with me as a physician with a person who's interested to understand what their options are. Number one, I have to also, I think this relates to one of the questions, as clinicians and investigators, like clinical trialists, we have to maintain some level of equipoise. That's a very important principle in investigational therapy development. And sometimes, I work in the field of ALS. It's even tough for me. I'm a human being, and I want to latch onto hope or hopeful signals. So it's very important, and that is the principle that should underlie the conversations. And really, I think the fundamental basic of how we would start by trying to protect clinical trials and try to ethically provide expanded access in any field or condition. And so I think that will drive what we do in the future. And then the second part is clinicians also being very well versed in the clinical trial space. So using clinical trial consortiums and advocacy groups to stay informed of what's currently available and what's on the horizon or future forecasts. So that's my visionary answer to that.
Thank you, Jinsy. That's very helpful. And I think that's a great place to close. I think we could, and also I think your point, Jinsy, speaks to why all of the perspectives represented today are helpful when these kind of conundrums come into place, right? You need all of the parts working together. You need a manufacturer that has all of this in mind as well. You need a clinician that has it available. You need IRB support. You need all of the support in order to make, fulfill, and evaluate and fulfill requests and be aware of kind of all of that's going on. So that's a long way of saying thank you to all who have participated, and certainly thank you to ISCT for co-sponsoring this event. Thank you to all of the faculty today for sharing your perspectives. And as we mentioned earlier, materials and additional resources will be shared with you via email. So with that, we'll close for today. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.